So today's Medina Monday message will focus on comparing a 90-10 and a 50-50 dual language program. This continues to be one of the questions that our team gets asked most often. And so I want to start by just reminding ourselves that both program models help students to leverage their linguistic power and allow kids to work towards bilingualism and biliteracy, grade level academic achievement in two languages, and working towards becoming a socioculturally competent human being. So both program models can serve that purpose. Now, two things to keep in mind before you even begin to select a program model or change from one program model to the other are: one, is it what the community wants and needs? And two, are we following that language allocation plan with fidelity? Because if those two things are not in place, then it really doesn't matter what it is that we select at the end of the day. So if you are about to establish a dual language program, please make sure that you get input from teachers and administrators and families and community members so that we can make sure that it's the dual language program that is best to suit and meet the needs of our community. If you're switching from a 50-50 to a 90-10 or switching from a 90-10 to a 50-50, make sure that you get input from teachers, administrators, families, and stakeholders. Because if we make decisions without input, that can also be the kiss of death for a dual language program. And then finally, we need to make sure that we're able to succinctly describe the language allocation plan. Because if we cannot describe what we're following, then the likelihood is that we are not following it with fidelity. Whatever is selected should be reflected in every single classroom, in every single school building in that district. When we have all sorts of language allocation plans, that can also be an obstacle that needs to be overcome. Okay, I have a couple of notes because I want to make sure that I capture everything. So let's start with a 90-10. One of the things that we love about a 90-10 dual language program, specifically one of the things that I love, is that we're able to amplify the home language of the emergent bilingual students who are adding English to their linguistic repertoire. This is important because remember that the why of dual language bilingual education in the United States is reparation for the linguistic trauma that we as educators have inflicted upon linguistically diverse student communities. And so the fact that students are able to leverage Spanish or Mandarin or Urdu or Arabic or Russian is a great benefit of a 90-10 because it sends that message that we value the language of the home and the community. Another thing that we love about a 90-10 program is because of that, we are also chipping away at systems of linguistic oppression in a U.S. schooling system where everything is English-centered. By having a 90-10 program, we once again are being overt about the fact that we are moving forward and chipping away at those systems so that other languages can rise to the surface, which is amazing. Some of the things to keep in mind, some of the obstacles, some of the considerations in terms of a 90-10, specifically the biggest one is that often in a 90-10 program, I'll use Spanish, English as an example, but it can be any two program languages. Many times in early childhood classrooms, teachers might see themselves and administrators might also expect this of early childhood teachers, that only the target language, only Spanish would be used in those early childhood grades. Often, students, whether in a one-way or a two-way 90-10 program, only learn to read in Spanish, as an example. And there's no specific connection to English literacy skills. That becomes a huge obstacle because then when those kids get to second, third, and fourth grade, they all of a sudden are expected to be able to read in English, even though we've not provided any specific English literacy support starting in kinder. And so that's one of the things that we're noticing that definitely needs to be kept in mind. Additionally, in a 90-10 program, often we don't have cross-linguistic connections starting in those early childhood grades, but also moving into the intermediate grades and on into middle school and high school. And so we want to make sure that starting in those early childhood grades, that kids understand and are given the opportunity to mobilize what content they've learned into the other target language, into the partner language, so that kids are able to begin to language their content understanding equally well in both program languages, even within a 90-10 program. And then finally, one of the things that often happens with a 90-10 is that we will have certain content areas that are taught in just one of the two program languages for extended periods of time. Like Obviously, in a 90-10 program, math, science, social studies will be facilitated in Spanish as an example, but with continuous and strategic cross-linguistic connections into English. But by the time that we get to a 50-50, which usually happens by third or fourth grade, kids should be receiving grade level instruction in all content areas all the time. But what is happening is that in some 90-10 programs, to make it easier on the adults, rather than thinking of what is best for kids, we have entire content areas that are taught for an entire year in one language. That is linguistic oppression. And usually what I will hear is, Dr. Medina, but we have time for bridging. Bridging or cross-linguistic connections are one part, an important part, but one part of a larger biliteracy instructional program. And so all it takes is one teacher to not adequately provide that support, and all of a sudden kids are not able to language what they learned in that one language equally well in the partner language. Remember that having content areas taught in one language for extended periods of time is linguistic oppression. Okay, let's move to a 50-50. So what are some of the benefits or some of the things that we love about a 50-50 program? So the first one is that, of course, students are able to engage in biliteracy instruction from the time that they begin the schooling system. And so many educators and many families are gonna love that, because then the kids are actually engaged in literacy instruction with connections to each other in both program languages. For some families, for the community, this is gonna be a second benefit that is huge. For the families that language more readily in Spanish or Urdu or Arabic or Tagalog, they're worried about linguistic oppression because families have experienced that oppression themselves as they move and language about in the world. And so some of those families that language Spanish or another target language, they're going to want their kids to just go immediately into English because they don't want their children to be exposed to the trauma that they've experienced themselves or that their ancestors or grandparents or great-grandparents experienced themselves. By having a 50-50, the families that language more readily in Spanish would feel more comfortable enrolling their kids in a dual language program. And it's understandable. That may be the need of the community. For two-way programs, the families that language more readily in English will also feel more comfortable knowing that the kids are getting instruction in all content areas in both program languages from the beginning, from pre-K or kinder, TK or kinder. Another piece that I really appreciated about a 50-50 is that both languages really strive to have that linguistic equity in terms of instruction, both with content, language, and also with culture. And so that's another added benefit. But there are some caveats to the great things that we can expect in a 50-50 program. Some of the obstacles, some of the things to consider. Number one, huge, the gentrification of dual language programs, specifically in a two-way program. It doesn't happen in a one-way dual language 50-50 program, but it does tend to happen in a dual language two-way 50-50 program. Often, the kids that come with a lot of linguistic, socioeconomic, and racial privilege are the kids that are celebrated in that dual language two-way 50-50 program. This obviously can happen in a 90-10 program as well, but for some reason we see it a lot in a 50-50 program. So we always must remember the why of dual language. Reparation for the linguistic trauma that we have inflicted upon culturally and linguistically diverse student communities. Another obstacle is similar to a 90-10. It's the cross-linguistic connections. Especially in a 50-50 program, sometimes what we see is two monolingual programs working side by side. We have a monolingual Spanish program working side by side a monolingual English program, but the two shall never meet. Well, that's crazy because students have to be able to mobilize what they learned equally well in both program languages in all content areas. And so it is a similar obstacle to a 90-10 because a 90-10 program always becomes a 50-50 program by third or fourth grade. And then the final consideration or obstacle to consider with a 50-50 program is exactly the same as in a 90-10. There are some school districts that have chosen to teach certain content areas for a year or two or the entire TK pre-K 5 experience all in one language.